Okay, the last of the triple constraints that we're going to talk about is cost. So we have, in the triple constraint, we have scope, time, and cost. And all of these three interact with each other. And changing one is going to manifest itself in some sort of requirement for changing the others. The last of them is cost. That's what we're going to talk about today. So cost management of the knowledge areas that we have that are integrated basically by this project integration management. It is the management of these resources that are going to be assigned to the project. Cost in definition, resource sacrifice or foregone to achieve a specific objective. Usually for our purposes is going to be measured in dollars. So we'll talk a little bit about what costs mean, but for the most part, what we're talking about is dollars, and then any of the projects you're going to be in, that's what's going to be looked at. There's three main processes: estimating, so cost estimating; cost budgeting means allocating the overall cost, and then controlling those costs as you move forward. And managing that control will be done through cost management, just like we've done with scope management and with schedule management. The basic principles of that cost management are laid out here. So essentially, there are tangible costs or benefits associated with a project. You can easily measure in dollars: salaries, equipment. When we go into the Microsoft project schedule, those are the two things that you're going to be entering and sort of managing as we go forward. It's also good to keep in mind there are intangible costs as well. So morale from working weekends, poor customer service, these kinds of things. If you're looking at how you're managing the scheduling aspect and the scope aspect, you can sometimes drive intangible costs that really translate themselves into risks that'll hit you later on in the schedule too. Direct costs are things that you can measure. Again, these are salaries and equipment, things that are being directly related to the product. Indirect costs are things like providing offices, help desks. Sometimes those would be part of the project if you're doing a total cost of ownership. Sometimes they aren't. So depending on what how your project lays out, you may need to account for those and you may not. Other cost principles that we need to know in terms of this chapter: sunk cost. I will continue to come back to this, especially when we get later in the term. Keep this definition in mind. Sunk cost is money that's been spent in the past. So whenever you're in that OODA loop and you're making decisions about your project going forward, you never consider sunk costs. That seems counterintuitive, but it's true. All you have is what's left, the resources you have left, and what it's going to take to finish out. So don't ever consider sunk costs when you're deciding whether to invest or continue. At milestones, all the decisions are based on go-forward cost-benefit analysis. Learning curve theory. This is the idea that as you do a task over and over, you tend to get better at it. So there's this learning curve that as productivity increases to a certain point where you really reach an optimal efficiency in these tasks. The first time you do it, it's going to take a lot more time, a lot more cost. Then as you get better, you start to realize the efficiencies and how to do it faster and all those kinds of things until you get to basically an optimum. That's what creates that curve. So we're going to go back to learning curve theory as we sort of scale what this project's going to look like over time. As we have to repeat tasks, they can take less time as you go on than they take the first time you do it. Reserves is the other issue that we'll deal with. These are dollars that are included in a cost estimate, but they're mitigating a cost risk by allowing for future situations that are difficult to predict. There are contingency reserves that allow for future situations that may be partially planned for. Sometimes called your known unknowns, like we're going to purchase some property. There's going to be some changes we have to make on the property. We don't know what it is, but we know there's going to be some changes, so we're going to allocate a certain amount of money to do that. All right, those are known unknowns. We don't really know what they are, but we know we're going to have to deal with them. Management reserves are a different kind of reserves that you hold for situations that are unpredictable, sometimes called unknown unknowns. We're going into this technology, we don't even know what the problems are going to be, so let's go ahead and put 10% away in the management reserve that we can use to manage it. That's based on not on the fact that we know in past history we've had this kind of task and it has these kind of unknown issues with them, but based on the fact that in all projects in the past, they've encountered surprising challenges that need to be accounted for in reserves. And that's what we do. So we will have that management reserve, and it'll be your job going forward to know how to manage that, to use it wisely as we go forward and make sure you've got some buffer there and some protection. IT projects are innovative, so there's always going to be some unaccounted tasks that need to be dealt with. So step back to estimating for a minute. A couple of different ways to do estimates. You have to take your estimates seriously if you want to complete the project within the budget constraints. So it's important to know the types of cost estimates and what people are asking for. Early on in the project, before you submit a project as an idea, people will ask for what's called a ROM, rough order of magnitude. And that can be anywhere from half as much as it actually costs to over 100% times as much as it costs. But it gives some sort of a figure, right? This is going to be a $200,000 project. It may wind up being as low as 100, it may wind up being 400, but at least we know it's not $1 million project. Okay, that's what we're kind of talking about. It's important to understand these kinds of differences. When we get into estimating for the next year's follow-on, I'll start asking you some of these things. Budgetary means a year out, this is what we're actually putting in the budget. Definitive means I'm close enough that here's what I'm actually assigning to all these tasks. Tools and techniques that you use are similar to what we did with scope. There's analogous or top-down estimates based on the cost based on previous similar projects. There's bottom-up estimates that basically say, let's take each of these WBS items and cost them out and build up a total. Or parametric that says, we've done these kinds of projects in the past. Here's the differences, and we know by changing certain characteristics of them, it'll change the overall cost picture by a little bit. That's a mathematical model to estimate project costs. A lot of consulting stuff does that when they do that. Typical problems with IT cost estimates is that, number one, we do them too quickly, right? We don't really take the time to go through there. That's a problem. There's a lack of estimating experience. Some of these projects are, frankly, innovative and new, so there's a lack of experience. Plus, as I say, we always bias towards underestimating because we visualize what the product's going to look like at the end. We don't visualize all the problems along the way. Management is going to desire accuracy, and that drives us to some fidelity that, frankly, we just can't get to. So cost budgeting then, after the estimating, you go into budgeting. That means allocating the work over time. WBS is a required input to this, okay? You've got to be able to produce a cost baseline that says, as we're doing these particular tasks, it's going to cost us this much. This cost baseline is something that's going to be part of your assignment as well. It's a time-phased budget that allows project managers to manage and measure cost performance. So even though you're doing these tasks, you have to break it up to say, at this month, let's say, I will spend $100,000. This month, I'm going to spend $150,000. This month, I'm going to spend, $75,000. It also allows the finance people who are managing your budget for you to understand what the outflows are going to be and what their cash requirements have to be for each of these months. That's an important baseline and allows you to sort of measure your cost progress as you go forward. You do that through cost control. Project cost control is going to include monitoring that cost performance, ensuring that project changes are included in the revised cost baseline. So if we're going through from a scope control aspect, we're changing parts of the scope, that will change in the schedule and task. It'll also change into our cost. And we have to make sure we're understanding all three of those as we move forward. Informing your project stakeholders constantly. If there are going to be authorized changes that will affect the project costs, keep everyone in the loop as to what the changes. We do that through EVM, and so we'll talk a little bit about EVM. Your book goes into some detail, and I'll allow them to kind of do that. But basically, what earned value management allows you to do is get a baseline for cost control in your project, and then sort of manage that and map it as you go forward. Some key values here that you're going to learn. There's a planned value. How much cost estimate plan to be spent. Actual cost is what you actually spend in a period of time. Earned value is how much of that value, an estimate of the physical work that's actually been completed based on the original cost. And the rate of performance is the ratio of the actual work completed to the percentage of the work that you planned. There's all the formulas down there, but basically when we start to ask them, what's the EAC, what's going to be our estimate completion, means how much is it actually going to cost. And CPI and SBI, as we go each week, it says, how am I doing on my cost, and how am I doing on my schedule? Am I, in general, through EVM metrics, meeting the planned measure of value and work that I expected to be creating throughout the course of this project? Some sample calculations are here. You can kind of go through these. If you have any questions, reach out to me. But when we present this, what you're essentially doing is presenting a chart like this. And on the top, you've got the actual cost. And this could be different. This is just a notional sample here. But in this value, in this picture, we see a project that's probably going to take longer than planned, and it's going to cost a little bit more. And that's what this chart is saying. As they measure the activity, their cost is actually a little bit high. So CPI is going to be high. The value of what they're seeing in terms of the completed tasks is a little bit low based on this plan. Okay, and so what you're going to see is towards the end of this, to get to the point where we've got this stuff complete, which is that line item, I'm actually going to be a lot farther along, and my cost is actually going to be quite a bit higher when I meet that notion. So this is going to be cost more, and it's going to take a little longer in this particular project. But by tracking the earned value as we go, we can draw these lines that kind of show us, well, yeah, this is what it looks like we're actually going to be done with. Those changes to variance can be significant. Sometimes they're small enough that if you really understand what's going on in the project and someone was out and you're not worried about it, you can ignore it, right? Sometimes you can apply management reserve. Sometimes you can, to get yourself back on track, using those kind of schedule mechanisms that we talked about in the last module. Modify resources. You move resources around to adjust without significant adjustment, or you can revise the plan. Relook at your activities and reallocate to reflect the facts on the ground. That may mean, if the variance is significant enough, we go back to scope. It may mean that we go back to look at some of those tasks that we want to crash or use our critical path method on. Those are the kinds of things. And if it's significant enough that we're way out of whack and this just isn't working, then we cancel the project. Manage changes to budget like we manage everything else. There's a lot of reasons we could have changes to budget. We could just have flawed estimates, right? In which case, we need to rework the estimate to complete and see what that actually looks like. We can have unknowns that are popping up bigger than what we thought. Those cases, you use reserves for those unknowns. And if they're bigger, then we have to, go back to the rework in the ETC. Or we could have permanent variances, just changes in material price, or the unions came back with a different number, because of some changes that they've had. You just have to deal with those, They're minor, you use the reserves. If they're major, then you go back to a replan, scope, cost, schedule, that kind of thing. Keep in mind, that's what we're trying to do. We want to keep this on track. So you always go back to, can we crash something? Can we do something at the task level? If you can't, then you apply reserves into there to get yourself on track. If the reserves aren't going to do it, then you may have to go back to scope and revisit that with the customer. That's basically it for cost. So that ties, you should have all the information now you need to go ahead and put a project schedule together, and we'll get going on that thing.